If we are to understand the consequences of spatial heterogeneity, we have to start with understanding the causes of spatial heterogeneity. Landscape heterogeneity stems from environmental variation, population and community processes, and disturbance. So these are all factors that generate spatial variation at the landscape level. One of the ways to begin to quantify and understand the causes of spatial variation is to detect it and to analyze it. The authors have a short section on this and highlight the role of remote sensing in increasing our ability to detect and understand patterns of spatial variation. For example, one of the new techniques that they highlight is LiDAR technology. With LiDAR technology, we can get better estimates of the carbon stocks of forests when it's combined with other technologies. So LiDAR uses lasers mounted on aircraft to get vertical heights in forests. And you can see that here, this is a rendition of the data that's acquired with LiDAR, showing open areas and forests. The differences in coloration comes from hyperspectral sampling, which allows the characterization of even individual species based on their reflectance of visible light. So when we monitor in a really high resolution way the differences in vertical distribution of different plants and trees on the landscape, we can see where different patches are generated on that landscape. Now, moving to a landscape perspective doesn't necessarily change the importance of state factors and interactive controls. If anything, it enhances them. Differences in abiotic characteristics and associated biotic processes account for the basic matrix of landscape variability. What this means is that when we go and look at spatial variation on a range of scales, we often go back to state factors and interactive controls, and those factors that are highlighted there in maintaining or generating these differences. There's a couple examples of these in the book, but for the Great Plains, these are maps of differences that we see in factors like climate, so mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation, hottest being at the bottom in the south, coldest being further north, but also you can see that there's the east to west gradient in precipitation. And some of the variation that we see in ecosystems within the Great Plains is simply associated with these large-scale patterns in climate. On a finer scale, though, there's differences in soil texture. This is a percentage of sand in soils, and you can see this right here is an area that's the sandhills of Nebraska. And there's other large areas of really sandy soil throughout the Great Plains. So on a broad scale, we see differences in climate. On a finer scale, differences in texture that would generate local to landscape level variation in ecosystem processes. Lastly, when all that is put together, we can see this variation in soil carbon content, which in part is being driven by differences in climate, but also, independent of that, soil texture. So these are areas, sandy soils tend to have a lot less soil carbon, but wetter places tend to have higher soil carbon. So when we take a look at soil carbon content in the Great Plains, it's a combination of temperature, precipitation, and texture that generates the broad and landscape level patterns that we see. Community processes and legacies also impact the spatial variation that we see in ecosystem properties. Historical legacies, stochastic dispersal events, and other community processes can modify the underlying relationship between environment and the distribution of species. So these community processes are really considered interactive controls. If we think about the state factors and what state factors determine ecosystem properties, that it was really potential biota that was relatively important and considered a state factor. But on the interactive side, it was factors like community composition or the species abundance that determined or at least influenced some of the ecosystem properties. So when we think about how an ecosystem functions, or a portion of an ecosystem, that there are historical legacies, there are these stochastic dispersal events of species getting to a place relatively randomly, and then other community processes that also have an impact. It's also important to note that past events shape modern patterns. One of the examples that they use is fires within Yellowstone, and this is a photograph from an airplane of Yellowstone after the 1988 fires. And you can see that although fire went through that landscape and burned a large portion of it, that there was a certain pattern to how that happened. And it wasn't uniform across that landscape. Some patches were relatively untouched by fire, others burned more extensively, others at a lower intensity. And so there are vagaries of just how the fire moved and its behavior through the landscape that ended up impacting the pattern of disturbance and what ended up being a matrix of unburned places and burned places. So when we took a look at the processes today, for example, in Yellowstone, the structure of the forest, its productivity, for example, is going to depend on whether the fire ended up burning it or not. And to a certain degree, that could be considered stochastic. Now, the authors also bring up the idea of something being at steady state, which means that more or less it's unchanging in time. Within that, though, is the idea of the shifting steady state mosaic. So on average, you could have a factor that more or less is unchanging over time, but that could be due to differences that we see among different patches that average out to be more or less similar, while each individual patch is not necessarily at steady state. So the idea here, for example, if we take a look at a forest, that you can have forest in different stages of regrowth over time. But as long as you have a relatively constant proportion of disturbed areas, young and old forests, on a broader scale, it could be more or less constant. And over time too, such that the disturbance is shifting in space and you get a mosaic of patches, but overall you have a steady state balance of these different patches. This graph shows a relationship between the effect of disturbance size and disturbance frequency on the stability of landscape processes. On the x-axis, we have the extent of the disturbance relative to the landscape extent. So basically, how large is that disturbance? Does it take up the entire landscape or just a small proportion of the landscape? And here we have the disturbance interval relative to the recovery interval. So those factors that happen relatively infrequently relative to how long it takes to recover, as opposed to those factors down here where the disturbance happens relatively frequently and it happens a lot faster than a system can recover from that disturbance to its initial state. So large disturbances that happen relatively frequently, are over here. Small disturbances that happen infrequently are over here. If we take a look at a small disturbance in this corner of the graph that doesn't happen too frequently relative to the rate of recovery, that really generates a system that's still going to be in equilibrium or steady state. It doesn't have a large impact. A small proportion of the area is going to be affected and it recovers relatively quickly. On the other hand, if you have a disturbance that impacts a large proportion of the landscape, and that happens pretty frequently, those systems become relatively unstable, and it's going to transform the system from its initial state. In the middle, we have a whole range of different other options. So we can have stable low variance under different conditions, but stable high variance when you get a good combination of extent and interval. And then here, stable and very high variance. So by varying the extent of a disturbance relative to the landscape that we're looking at and making it relatively frequent relative to how long it takes to recover, these systems can be stable but generate different amounts of variance. As those disturbances become more frequent or larger, the landscape becomes more heterogeneous and individual patches are increasingly likely to shift to different successional trajectories. This idea is that large disturbances generate non-steady state mosaics. So when we have these large disturbances that occur relatively infrequently, but are large enough to affect the balance of recovery on the landscape, we can get these non-steady state mosaics, such that if you look over time, you're not going to have a constant proportion of areas that have been disturbed and have not been disturbed, for example, or in different stages of recovery from that disturbance, and emphasizing that it's still going to be a mosaic. One example would be Hurricane Hugo that had come through in 1989 through the Caribbean and up the East Coast. This is, again, a large storm that impacted a large proportion of the area in its path. And here in Puerto Rico, this is the entrance to the Caribbean National Forest, 3 days after Hurricane Hugo came through in 1989. You can see that tree mortality was huge in this area, and as high as 35% in a portion of that. So on some scales, the hurricane came through and really altered the dynamics of that system, such that when you took a look at the functioning of that system on average, it could no longer be considered to be at steady state, and it deviated from that. The frequency of large hurricanes like that can generate disturbances that can be maintained in a steady state condition depending on how large an area they are able to impact. When that area becomes too large or too frequent, can often get non-steady state mosaics that differ from their initial composition. We also have human effects to think about for spatial variation. And the pattern that we go through and cut areas versus allow them to regrow can generate differences in the spatial arrangement, for example, and whether that system is considered in steady state or non-steady state. In addition, agriculture generates patches of disturbed areas initially within an undisturbed system, but as that pattern of agriculture changes, we can shift to a different steady state mosaic or maintain a system in a non-steady state condition.